Alright, so this is going to begin the little remediation over macroeconomics. This is kind of just an introduction to macroeconomics, and like you can see here, seeing the big picture, right? So the first thing, as far as like macroeconomics and what it actually is, this is like anytime we're dealing with the entire country as a whole, right? We're looking at either the country, the nation, whatever, the entire state, the entire globe as a whole, whatever it may be, and we're dealing in aggregates, it says right here, and what an aggregate means is it's just the total. So we're looking at the total of an entire country's income, we're looking at all the consumption, we're looking at all the investments, everything that's being done in the entire country, not just like looking at your personal budget, but we're looking at the entire country's budget as a whole, we're looking at the entire country's expenditures as a whole. Alright, so again, the macroeconomists, like, they look at the entire economy, right? They're worried about everything as a whole. So in order to look at all this, we need to be able to measure everything as a whole, right? So the performance of the entire economy, right? We're looking at that. So we're either looking at national output, we're looking at price stability, or in other words, we're looking at inflation, right? We're looking at unemployment rates or employment itself, and we're looking at aggregate demand. And aggregate demand is all the demand from the entire country, right? Everything that every single consumer wants. All right, so gross domestic product, this is kind of the first measurement that we looked at of everything, right? That kind of measures the entire economy as a whole. And it's everything that we produce, so it's the market value of everything that we produce in our country, so in our nation's borders, in a given period of time. Usually it's 1 year, right? The things that aren't included in GDP are intermediate goods. Remember, those are goods that are used to make other things. So if you're talking about your pencil, well, the wood that's used to make that pencil or the plastic, it's not included because that's an intermediate good. It's used to make the pencil. Right? Secondhand sales, these are anything that's used. And then non-market transactions, well, I mean, you can look at this as kind of stuff like the flea market where you're going to pay cash for it, and it may not ever really necessarily get recorded, or it could even be illegal stuff. Right? I mean, you can kind of use your imagination there as to what that would include. All right, so the following is used to calculate GDP, and again, this is our formula that you should be familiar with, right? The C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Remember, the X minus M right here could be X to the sub N, it could be F, right? But all it means is exports minus imports. All right, we're looking at our new unit when we're talking about trade deficits. This is where it comes from, right? Is this X minus M. But the C stands for consumer spending, the I is for investment spending, or remember, you can look at that as business spending too, right? This is not just consumer spending, this is investments by businesses, like they're buying machinery, right? That's considered an investment because they're going to use that in the future, right? And then it's also talking about government spending as well. So all of these things together equal our GDP. And again, if you kind of look at your country projects, your websites that you're having to make, well, this is how it was broken down, right? I asked y'all to break down how was your GDP being calculated, right? How much of it was consumer spending? How much of it was investment and government spending? All right, so the big thing with GDP is that a lot of times it doesn't measure the productivity, and maybe sometimes it misses out on just growth over time, right? So to overcome this, right, we use something that's called real GDP or per capita GDP, right? Real GDP puts it in terms of how much money is it in today's dollars, right? And then per capita GDP tells us how much GDP is each individual person responsible for. This is going to be kind of for the silver and gold stuff. So if you're kind of planning on going with the bronze route, well, then you probably can ignore the next slide or so. All right, but the first thing, so real GDP is the value of everything, and it's adjusted for current prices, right? So in other words, the current value of the dollar. And we would do this by using something called a GDP price deflator, right? And we'll kind of have a little bit more about that. But what it lets us do is it lets us compare year to year without having to worry about, well, back then a Coke only cost $1, or back then a Coke only cost 50 cents. It lets us compare it kind of apples to apples, right? It lets us kind of say, in today's dollars, how much was a Coke worth back in 1950 or whatever it may be. So the next thing, the per capita in GDP is just our GDP divided by population. So what this tells us is that our entire GDP, how much of it is each individual person responsible for? All right, so moving on, here's an example, right? So if we have 100 inhabitants and each inhabitant spends $100, right, so on and so forth, you can kind of read all the way through this. I'm not going to tell you and all this good jazz, but what is our per capita GDP for this country, right? Well, so if you look at this, 100 people spending $100, well, we got to multiply that, right? And then so on and so forth down here, each producer spends $50 per year. Well, there's 50 of them, or there's 20 of them. So 20 times 50, right? And then these producers, so on and so forth. You got to be able to do the math on this and just kind of add it up and see what your per capita GDP is going to be. Well, once you get your GDP together, all you got to do is divide it by 100, and that's going to get you to your per capita GDP. Alright, so if we've done this, right, consumer spending is 10,000, investment is 1,000, government's 3,000, so on and so forth. So we've got $15,000 in GDP, and so if we divide that by the 100 people in our country, well, then we wind up with a per capita GDP of 150. And I can tell you that that's very, very low. So again, it's just an example. Alright, so now then, looking at consumer spending, right? This is the biggest part of GDP that we have, right? It is monstrous. This is what drives our economy, is our spending, right? It kind of, again, too, if you remember our circular flow model, right, and how that actually determines a lot of things, right? Every time we spend money, it creates money through the economy. And a lot of times it's either hope or fear, right? You can kind of think about that. That's driving how we're spending, right? We may fear that prices go up in the future, and now we're going to spend a lot of money now. Or we may be hoping that good times are coming, so we're going to wait right now, and we're going to wait till the future and spend our money. All right, economic growth, and again, this is kind of one of our big goals for all economies, is we want to see stable growth over time, right? So it's just, anytime we see an increase in the goods and services being produced, we know we've got growth, right? And we know this because we can look at these different indicators, right? We can look at our consumer spending. If it's going up, more than likely we're seeing growth. If GDP is increasing, if unemployment rate is decreasing, if we're in an expansion, we know that we're seeing economic growth, right? And again, we're hopeful of the future anytime we see economic growth. An economic decline, exactly the opposite, right? So, I mean, anytime our goods and services from one year to the next go down, and again, what's happening over here is our consumer spending, GDP, is going down, unemployment rates increasing, and we may be in a recession, right? And again, we're fearful of the future in these times, right? So this has been 7, 8, 9 years ago, and maybe even for some folks right now, right? We're worried about the future. We don't know what's necessarily in store, so maybe we might stop spending as much, or consumer spending may go down a little bit. All right, aggregate demand. Remember, this is total spending, right? And this is the total demand for everything in the entire country. Right, so if you look at this, this is our aggregate demand curve, right? And it just tells us at all price levels, how much are we willing to buy at every single price, no matter what, right? So no matter what the level of inflation is in our entire country, this is what we're going to be willing to buy at every single price, right? And it's just like the regular demand that we looked at earlier in the semester too. Aggregate supply, no different than the other supply curves we saw, right? But except for this time, it's the total supply of everything in the entire country, right? So it tells us everything that we've seen. It tells us everything that we're making, that all of our producers are willing to make at each and every single price. All right, so, if we put them together, right, we can kind of see what our GDP is, right? So in this case, aggregate demand is decreased. So if we look at this point right here, this was our original equilibrium. Well, when aggregate demand went down, our prices went down. So we're seeing deflation, right? So our prices have gone down, right? Our output has also gone down. See, look, we were making this quantity here before. Well, now it's shifted left, and so we're making less stuff. So you can probably assume that we're more than likely in a recession here, right? Because everything's going down. Consumer spending is going down. How do we know that? Because demand is going down. If demand is dropping, then consumer spending must be dropping. Yep. Have fun trick-or-treating tonight there, kiddos, and as usual, got any questions, just ask.